Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartiya, and in this special edition of TFiR Insights for Open Source Summit, today we have with us once again Chris Wright, CTO of Red Hat. Chris, first of all, welcome again. We were supposed to meet in person, but because of COVID-19, we are doing it remotely. Today was your talk at the event. Tell us a bit about the talk itself. What are some key points that you touched there?
I think at a high level, what I really wanted to focus on was open source it's a global movement. It creates an opportunity for people to come together around the world to solve big challenging problems. Most of those we are familiar with. We think in terms of open source developers coming together to work on Linux, open source developers building all the software that you find in the Apache Software Foundation, or they just thousands and millions of Git repositories filled with software. But I think what's interesting to look at is there are a set of issues that are broader than just technology and technology development. And open source communities and that collaborative model create an opportunity for us to look at how we can make an impact in a variety of ways. And so, for example, there's real issues today with COVID as a health crisis, a pandemic. What can we do together as open source communities to address that? There's questions around inequality and justice and all of the racial concerns that have been very prominent in the news recently. There's specific thoughts around how technology can be a part of that dialogue. For example, bias in machine learning models. What does that, what does that do to our decision-making process as a society? So, all these different ways that we can look at that collaboration and solving these global scale challenges, I think it's a dialogue worth having, and I want to talk a little bit about that today.
No, you touched on a lot of points, like when you're talking about bias in AI, and I think there was a case just a few days ago where a man was arrested based on the facial data that was collected, and so there are a lot of debates going on now. What open source has done or showed to us is that, first of all, it's distributed. Your developers here all around the globe. Most of us, I'm not a developer, but I do feel part of the open source community. We work remotely from home. Third is that we, most of us come from different countries, different cultures. We are already distributed. So somebody is from Asia. Even within, let's say, we talk about skin color, so if you look at people from Italy versus Germany versus France versus UK, their culture is different. The way the Italians solve a problem is different from the way process-focused Germans solve a problem. So when you bring all these people together, suddenly the problem-solving skills kind of improve. That's why open source technologies, they have kind of become the de facto software development model. I mean, not de facto, but it's inching there. So there are a lot of things that we can already learn from open source, leverage from open source. And at the same time, when you are catering to a user which is global, but if your developer base has a monoculture, you do not even understand those issues. So how will you kind of bring it into your product itself? So can you talk a bit about how open source is not only to develop, but also as a consumer, it helps when your teams are diverse, when your teams are distributed from all around the globe?
I always talk about open source projects needing diversity in two different dimensions. One is the developer community themselves need to will benefit from having the broadest set of inputs. And that's exactly what you're describing in terms of different cultures, different people come with different mindsets, different ways of doing problem solving. And so having the most diverse set of engineers and developers working on a problem together, I believe, and my experience is it produces the best output, the best outcome. There's another form of diversity, which it's more about what the application is supporting. And certainly when you get more into the infrastructure space, the variety of workloads, the different types of requirements that are placed on a software platform, as it rises to meet the challenge of all these different requirements, the platform itself is improving. And so now you're talking about not just the diversity of the community building the software, but the kinds of functionality that the software needs to include to be effective. And I mean, my favorite example is Linux, which is over a quarter century old and has evolved with massive change in hardware, really different view of what a modern application workload looks like today than it did even 10 years ago. And it's that diversity of inputs into the system that creates a better architecture and withstands the test of time, builds longevity, builds maintainability, sustainability into the whole model, which I think it's just a key attribute, a key characteristic to open source development.
This is a topic you may or may not want to address or talk about, but right now there's a lot of movement going on, Black Lives Matter, and a lot of LGBT community. Now, what happens is that as we were discussing earlier, when you bring people from different communities, different culture, different background, different belief systems, it helps improve. So then you won't have issues. There's something called subconscious bias, that goes into your code itself because you're not aware. That can be solved when your development teams are diverse themselves. Now, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't want to get into the political discussion, but there is some kind of ban on immigration where you can bring in diverse workforce. So if you are not bringing in diverse workforce from around the globe while you are serving the global community, doesn't that hurt the whole, not only software or product development, but also it hurts the community that you're serving, which is global here? I mean, Red Hat technologies, Apple technologies, Google technologies are not used just within the US. It's used globally in Africa, in Asia, everywhere in the world.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'm not an immigration specialist, and I don't really even pretend to understand what drives all of the politics behind immigration policy. And I think it's important that we keep a healthy flow of thoughts and people coming through the US where I live, because I see so much positive impact from that. But if you just look at open source communities and how we collaborate, we don't collaborate exclusively through co-location. We collaborate through digital medium, which means that's accessible globally. And I think that's a really important reality of open source communities, and part of why they can be so effective. As an example, we spent quite a bit of time doing very directed outreach to the Japanese development community, because we saw such great potential in terms of university research and interest in open source projects, specific areas like IPv6. And we spent time through different open source foundations like the Linux Foundation to really outreach to that community to help bridge the gap and bring them into the global community, which didn't mean those Japanese developers relocated to the US. It meant they became part of our global collaboration. And that improved how we operate. We're, as an asynchronous communication world through digital media, we have a lot of opportunity that we're leveraging today, where we've all been changed our home offices, our offices to be working from home. So that's a critical resiliency that we've got built into open source communities that, again, doesn't require everybody to live in the same location or country, or we're really tapping into what I think of as a global movement. And the one thing that's critical in that process is developing an ear for just listening. We had a great internal to Red Hat presentation from our diversity and inclusion, a leader in our diversity and inclusion program. And she really stressed listening, and listening with empathy. So it's not about trying to prove or disprove somebody's experience, but just hearing their experience. And I have a very different experience than somebody from either a different country or who is a different gender, even living in the US, different ethnicity, different skin color. And as a result, I can't fully relate to everybody's experience, but I can listen and I can develop an understanding. And I think it's that empathy that we're trying to develop as I'd like to believe, as a global society that helps us really evolve. And if you think of open source communities as taking the best ideas independently from whom they originate, then we really need to be able to listen to people and recognize their ideas, which we don't always speak the exact same language and jargon. And certainly we don't have the same, we weren't born using the same languages. So we're really working to bridge those gaps. And I think listening as a key way to think of how you engage, and listening with empathy, critical ways to help improve the welcoming of a community, which is going to thrive on the diversity of the people that are part of that community. So all kind of interconnected there.
I mean, even if you look at the open source community, it is kind of diverse, but there is still a lot of problems. In some cases, culturally, because it's kind of, you don't control the community. Anybody can come and join, and people also bring their opinion with that. And that actually, in open source world, opinion and code is always in abundance. But there is something in the culture and in the code itself. Recently, there was some, like master and slave is a very good example where GitHub said, they are going to remove. What are the other such examples which you see are troublesome and should be addressed? So let's talk about the culture and the code itself, where you see we still need to make a lot of improvements.
Well, I think the goal is being welcoming and finding areas where we use offensive language and just assume it's not offensive. Master and slave as an example, which is not unique to open source. It's a terminology that's part of the IT language in highly available systems. Doesn't make it right. It just means it's broader than just open source. Identifying terms like that and working as a community to remove those terms and just evolve past that. We can express those same concepts without being offensive, and as a result of being offensive, marginalizing a whole population that has a lot to contribute to the software that we're trying to build. We're looking even, that not only in that context of highly available systems and the terminology around master slave. Git as a repository often choose the defaults to the main branch of development as the master branch. So changing that terminology to say that's your main branch or some other term that's not offensive. These are steps that we can take as communities that do not set the community back at all. There's work to be done, but it doesn't really set the community back, and it sets up the community to just be more open and welcoming of that broader, more diverse and inclusive population, communities that we're trying to outreach to. We also use terms like whitelist and blacklist. We can change those to language like approve and deny, just to remove the charged language around color, which will be quickly associated with skin color. I mean, these are things that might feel like we should have done it a long time ago, and frankly, we should have. It's taken a lot of just protests and realization around the world to see the time for action is now. And so I think we're seeing some of that happen today. We're seeing communities really rally around how they can be more inclusive and eliminate some of the terminology that's just not welcoming.
But most of these things, as you rightly said, go beyond open source. We also hear something about brownfield deployment or greenfield deployment. Now, there's also a problem that first of all, where do you draw the line that, hey, this could be seen offensive? There are two things. One thing, everything can be offensive in one context or the other. A second is that there are a lot of things that are offensive, but we were insensitive. That is one part. The second part of the question is that there are individual communities like GitHub made a decision, or there has to be a kind of collective effort. Open source community is very good at it to bring all those people together under the same table and just define some terms. So can you talk about these two aspects? Where do you draw the line, and then how do you actually address it instead of making it some sporadic, fly-by changes that were made?
Well, I think that's our biggest concern. Speaking from Red Hat's point of view, we don't want to tokenize the gesture and make it feel as if there's not a genuine need for change. And then at the same time, open source communities have a terminology called bike shedding, where you can get into very lengthy and detailed arguments over the less relevant parts of the discussion. And so how far we investigate language and where that line is, I think it's a valuable conversation to have, and also know that we will never be perfect. We've got to really just keep pursuing improvements. And I think that picking some terminology that we agree upon more broadly across communities will be really helpful, because the way open source communities and developers in those communities tend to operate is that they don't live only in a single community. So if we pick really different languages in different communities, it's just a missed opportunity. So establishing, it doesn't have to be a standard, but some common best practices, really helpful. So that when you go from one project to the next, and you want to merge your changes, you're not merging to master and merging to main and merging to root and merging to trunk, and it just gets too confusing, or similar to those broad IT terminology questions or terms. So one of the things we can facilitate across communities is a discussion around the preferred language, and make sure we're inclusive in that discussion, and get to the point where we're comfortable and just make the changes and move on. And these are actually, it's a lot of work. And especially if you think about changes that impact things like configuration variables, which are documented, which becomes part of a user experience, you can't just change it. Now that means an upgrade to the system, change the config variable name, you could break the entire system. So there's a process and a thought behind how we introduce this change, where we can't just be too reactive. We really have to think in terms of what can we do together as communities to just improve the state of the art and evolve, and know that it's an iterative process.
Yeah, very well. Now, this is once again a question that you might want to choose not to answer, or we can take it out. There has been a lot of debate about not selling your XYZ technology to XYZ government organization. I don't want to name any organization, but whether it's facial or AI, I am against that idea. Not only in open source world, in the open source world, we don't discriminate. Anybody can use the technology. We don't dictate who should or should not use, because if you start dictating, where will you draw the line? You might not want to sell XYZ country because according to your trade embargoes or whatever, they are bad guys. We should not be deciding who are the good guys or bad guys. And then if you do not sell your technology to XYZ government agency, if they need it, they will acquire it from somewhere else. So what are your thoughts about that? Personally, I am against that. If there is technology, it should be accessible whoever wants it, despite whatever your political views are, ethical or moral views are. What are your thoughts about it?
I'll be honest, you're asking a really challenging and complicated question. And it starts to blur the lines between what is the commercial world, what is a kind of an activist view, a person's ethics. It's a very complicated space, and I sort of applaud the efforts around being careful, for example, of how facial recognition technology is put to use. And there's been some great public statements from large companies like I believe Microsoft, Google, IBM. About how their facial recognition technology is not something they want to sell to be used for a form of surveillance. That's just something that we don't want to live in a surveillance state. It gets really complicated, and you think about, what does Red Hat do? We build an operating system, we build a set of infrastructure tools and platforms, and the ways that those tools get used are so varied and not always even clear to us that it's hard to go. I mean, it's a slippery slope, and you can quickly go very far down a path that's creates outcomes that aren't really the intended outcome. So it's a complicated question. I think one of the things we can do is just raise awareness and make sure that where we have real concerns around technology. I mean, it's troubling to me that two identical CVs or resumes submitted to a reviewer using automation, changing the name to be a name that's ethnically associated with a white man versus a black man, changes the outcome and the likelihood that candidate gets called back, that's problematic. That's our systems and our technology propagating a bias that I think we should be aware of and think, how can we eliminate that? And that's something I feel is reasonable, but it's a very complicated space, and specifically in the machine learning area, understanding how decisions are made and making that visible is a very practical step we can take towards improving our understanding of the implications of technology on society.
Now, let's just change the topic for a while. It is not change our topic, but we are stuck in a home, which also means the way we are talking to each other is network. And that's where I'm kind of, 5G, when we hear the word, we hear a lot of, we see a rosy picture. At the same time, when you talk to a lot of people, they say, hey, it's not there yet. It's not ready yet. So what are your thoughts about what role 5G will play, not only in the COVID-19 crisis, but in post-COVID-19, where people have realized that it's not practical to have somebody on the location all the time. Edge computing will become more dominant. Share your thoughts on that. What work is going on? What are your thoughts? How it will evolve?
Well, it's a fascinating space because there's technology. There's also real social implications. I think I've had an opportunity to speak with quite a few different business leaders over the last few months, and a couple of themes have emerged. One, clearly, workforces have been sent home for safety. So that's no news here. That's not a surprise. But what's interesting in there is it's not uncommon for companies to experience what they didn't expect, which is productivity increases. So meaning people are working from home. They're not, I think there was a lot of worry that people go home and have a challenging time getting their work done. Instead, people have gone home and are being just as productive, if not more productive. This is, from conversations across a number of different leaders in many different businesses and enterprise areas. So I think that's kind of interesting. And as a person who's spent, 15 years almost working remotely from home, it doesn't surprise me, but I love to see others experiencing that, and that it's meaning it could fundamentally change just the what we think of as the workplace going forward. And how we think of bringing people together to collaborate face-to-face in real time, and what the value is, and how, what are the things that we need to do to facilitate that. I think it's fantastic. I think it creates a lot of opportunity for us to rethink just that workforce and how we're distributed, especially coming from an open source point of view, where we look at global communities. I think it's really helpful to think in terms of maintaining a distributed workforce. What connects us together is the network. So now there's all these interesting challenges in computer networks, in telecommunications networks. 5G is on the horizon. I mean, it's very much a part of our future. It's already being built and rolled out depending on your geography. Question is more about how much does it impact our daily lives and in what way. And I think initially what we're seeing is, first of all, it's kind of amazing that the telecommunications networks are functioning as well as they are, considering how radically life changed so quickly. So some interesting ways to look at it. The density of cellular communication in urban areas where you'd have businesses, people connecting their phones to those cell stations or base stations, they're all home. So those have gone kind of dormant. Meanwhile, everybody at home is using their broadband connectivity to get access to the internet and to communicate. Pretty substantial shift in where bandwidth is coming from and how it's utilized. And the networks didn't fall over, which by itself is pretty impressive. It brings to the forefront some questions around mobile access and fixed access, and where you can have what we call fixed and mobile convergence to build more efficiency. So the very back end of the system is common. At some point, you're physically connecting to something, or you're through radio waves connecting directly to something. So you have that level of geographic distribution that's required. But the more you can offload into common internal platforms, that's a way to reduce your cost to run your networks. So we're seeing that, and that's typically what we would call NFV, that internal cloud virtualization platform, which in the end becomes a prerequisite for 5G. So I think what we're seeing is questions around the capital expenditures of getting to the 5G network. It's in a time with economic uncertainty, people are going to be careful in how they invest, needing to ensure that the networks themselves are scaling to meet the need, including the operational expense, to really look at where can you introduce 5G that brings new capabilities. Like you and I could be having a immersive reality experience in the future, and really feeling like we're sharing a 3D world with one another, which is definitely a part of the 5G future vision, and maybe a little ways off still, but you can see how we're building towards that and how this current experience is changing how we think about how important those remote digital communications are.
But one thing not unique, but different with 5G is that, unlike previous generation, very previous generation, most of it is software-defined networking. Most of it is using open source technology. Yes, there is real hardware, but, like Verizon and TNT, they're leveraging OpenStack a lot, to build their whole, network stack. So how does, open source and being software-defined, kind of make it faster to move as compared to the previous generation networking stack?
The previous world in networking is very focused on standards and definitions and specifications, which themselves...
And black boxes as well.
And black boxes and black box interoperability. And so maybe we should change the language. The world of open source technology kind of opens up what's inside and allows the industry to collaborate on a common platform. So we don't have to have re-implementations of the same thing multiple times. Immediate efficiency. With that efficiency, you get the opportunity to say, we don't need to write a specification to standardize on a common platform that we're all using and developing together. We can start documenting best practices, and that whole process just speeds everything up substantially. So I think that's the easiest way to think about how we're moving faster in networks. And then there's definitely just a general efficiency that goes along with not having to rebuild common infrastructure repeated times. Certainly if it's done in a closed and proprietary manner, then it's potentially bespoke per solution. So it's not a very efficient way to build infrastructure. So I think open source opens it up, creates opportunities for collaboration, creates ways to build best practices and what I would call de facto standardization, without requiring specification and the whole process that goes along with standards bodies and everything like that.
Awesome. Yeah, very well said. Thank you, Chris, so much for taking your time out today and talking to us. I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.